Question 56, Deputy John Curran, please.
Minister, you're well aware that Ireland are going to miss our 2020 emissions targets quite significantly. My question to you is, can you give a sectoral breakdown of where you expect these targets to be by 2020 and then the associated cost to the Exchequer by failing to meet our targets?
Minister.
Yeah, under the 2009 effort-sharing decision, which put in place binding annual emission targets for each year between 2013 and 2020 for sectors outside the EU emission trading system, Ireland must achieve reductions of 20% relative to 2005 level of emissions. The actual trends show that under the influence of the economic crash, Irish emissions were below target ceilings in the years 2013 to 2015 inclusive. However, as recovery took hold, it became clear that we had not broken the link between economic recovery and emissions, which rose significantly above the target ceiling in 2017 and continued to do that. The latest projections published in May 2018 by the EPA indicate that emissions from those sectors, the ETS sector, the non-ETS sectors of the economy covered by the effort-sharing decision could be on aggregate 17 million tonnes, or 5% above the cumulative target for the period. However, more worryingly, the 2020 levels that year on its own are projected to be only between 0 and 1% below 2005 levels in 2020. So this puts us in a very bad starting position to meet our 2030 targets. The EU emission system does not fix separate targets for our different sectors. The effort-sharing decision allows Member States to meet their targets using unused emissions allowances from earlier years, or through purchasing allowances from other Member States or on international markets. Ireland has certain accumulated credits already acquired. However, I am advised that Ireland will need to purchase allowances to meet the projected shortfalls in 2019 and 2020. My department currently estimates the costs of this requirement to be in the region of 6 million to 13 million, depending on the price and final quantity of allowances required. The recently agreed effort-sharing regulation sets out binding annual emission targets for EU member states in the period 2021 to 2030, with Ireland's target in 2030 is to achieve a 30% reduction in emissions relative to 2005. I've recently secured government approval to prepare an all-of-government plan which will set out the actions to be taken to make Ireland a leader in responding to climate change and to set out how Ireland will, at the very least, meet its targets for the period to 2030.
Deputy Curran.
Thank you, Minister, for your response. And first of all, I wish you well in the position you have. I think it's a critical role, and I think young people are very, very cognizant of the challenges ahead of us. And I think they're up for the type of change that's necessary. Mike, the reason I asked you the actual cost is it's important to realise there is a significant, as we go year on year, if we don't address this, there will be a significant cost to the Exchequer and it will grow. As you rightly said, we have credits from the recession years, if you want to look at it like that, and that has brought us up to 2017 or thereabouts, and we pay as we go forward from there. So it's critically important that key elements that the government have responsibility for are actually implemented. Earlier on you were talking about microgeneration and you were talking about solar. One of the things in terms of renewable energy that has not happened is commercial solar has not been significant. In 2015, 0.01% of electricity was generated from solar, which has gone only to 0.04%. It's a tiny, and most of the reason is that government have failed to produce guidelines around solar. It has come up time and time again. There's plan after plan, planning application after planning application being granted, but yet we're not seeing that as a deliverable, renewable source of energy connected into the grid, and it should be.
Minister.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. I think the Deputy is absolutely right. Like the net was 17 million tonnes, so you price that. Now, we actually had credits, but we also have acquired credits already. So what we're going out into the market now isn't even 17 million tonnes worth. So, but I think, looking to the future, the gap will get bigger. You're right about commercial solar. I think it's not solely the planning guidelines. It is more expensive and it hasn't won at auction or any of these refits. Now, I think as Deputy Canny was describing, the next the 2019 auction, one would expect offshore or onshore wind to again dominate those auctions. But I think there is the potential to have a reserve to see the start of some solar. And I think that is important. It still is more expensive, but those costs are coming down very dramatically. But I think, as Deputy Deering was saying, you know, we need to, in combination, and I think you said it yourself, in combination with this now becoming more cost-effective, we need to make sure that the guidelines are fair. Now, I know there has been an issue with the Department saying, the Department of Housing in that case, saying no guidelines are needed, the guidelines are already there, but I will have a conversation with Minister Owen Murphy as part of this process to see, do we need to issue some sort of clarification so you know, decisions can be taken where they're appropriate. But there are guidelines, so it's not true to say there aren't guidelines, but I think some people seem to have been waiting for additional you know, guidelines to be issued.
I don't want to spend my whole contribution on just solar, but I'll make the point, whether there are guidelines required or not, something is wrong because we don't have the output that we should have. And it's fine to say we'll have, you know, further wind and so forth. We need a mix of renewables from the point of view of reliability and continuity rather than being overly dependent on one source or another. The other comment I want to make in terms of our emissions is around the whole area of transport. And I suppose it's interesting to note that it was only last week that the low emission bus trial actually began in Dublin, something that government have been talking about for ages and ages. Minister, you have to take responsibility across all of the departments in government, not just your own department. There are funds made available, there are programmes made available, but the actual implementation is very, very slow. I've been asking for a considerable period of time in terms of the Department of Transport, in terms of low emission buses for Dublin. And while it doesn't make a huge output individually, it's leading by example. It's setting the infrastructure for transport in Dublin for the future, and the government have a key role to play in that. There's a carbon reduction programme in the Department of Transport. There's about 5 million in it. The vast bulk of that money, I understand, isn't even used this year. So, Minister, these are the challenges facing you. We can have scheme after scheme, programme after programme, but if the implementation isn't there, we're not making the progress. And to the point I made at the beginning, while our fines are relatively low, if we continue on the path we're on, our annual costs in terms of failing to meet those targets will grow because of the credits we've carried forward from the recession.
You know, first of all, just to be clear, I don't want any misunderstanding. I'm not taking responsibility across all departments for delivery here. I've been given the job of developing a plan, but you know, in this case, it will be about seeking to hold other departments to account, and it will be as much the Taoiseach's responsibility as my own to actually see delivery. So I'm not becoming someone who can go to every department and tell them what to do. But you know, I think you're absolutely right. We need to create a framework where collectively we start to address this, that every decision we take factors carbon into it. And I think it was promising to see the Secretary-General to the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform outline that in his view the price of carbon ought to, in public spending decisions, should be at €100 a tonne for 2030 and 265 for 2050. So they're beginning to think in terms of a rapid ramp up on the cost of activities that are carbon intensive. And it's important that that message gets through to decision makers, be it low emission vehicles, diesel buses or whatever. And I suppose that's my job, is to make sure that that agenda is brought forward.
Thank you, Minister.